funny and witty, David Cameron, but at this last week's Prime Minister question, he was downright mean, which means he was rattled, and it was only afterwards that he figured out that damp squib might be a better line to take on this. I don't know. I think that the austerity is so obviously self-defeating, and it ties back in, by the way, with what's going on in the Eurozone, that I'd like to think that rather than saying it's going to be like this for 6 years or 10 years, that sometime in the next 18 months, some politician somewhere is going to finally, get the courage to say it simply doesn't work. Preferably someone working inside the coalition. They'll bring down the coalition, we can have a proper election, and perhaps have policies that aren't based on austerity.
Well, I thought that the British had stopped striking because of Margaret Thatcher, so perhaps the tide is turning. And it was an impressive...
But is it a strike if it's just one day? Come on.
Yes, I agree with that. I think it was impressive, though, to see that many people taking to the streets. But the real question is whether it will have an effect on the government, probably not, as Polly said, or whether, it was just a display of anger with no real consequences. And I think that's perhaps the latter, because we're talking about a generation which has been brought up on short-term contracts, individual contracts. There's no collective bargaining, and essentially, even on so many workplaces, trade unions are not even recognised. So it's very, very hard to get something out of the government, or to even bring the government to its knees and disrupt the country in a very effective manner.
I was struck by two things. One was it did remind people what public sector workers do. Never mind the merits of the strike or whatever. They protect the ports. They teach our children, and so on and so on and so on. But this division between what the public sector gets allegedly and what the private sector gets allegedly, and the risks and benefits of each. Do you think that's a sensible way to have a debate about the future of the country, or do you think it's fundamentally divisive and doesn't work?
Well, Gavin, you're asking me the wrong question, I think.
Why?
I'd rather you really ask me whether that strike was important for society and the issue of freedoms,
right.
Because one great thing that I admire about Britain and Western countries, even if I criticize a lot of how they approach Africa and so on, is this wonderful freedom of people aggrieved to go out there and demonstrate. We've talked a lot on this program about Uganda and the machete guys of the government just cutting down people, shooting them.
For peaceful
demonstrating, and we're demonstrating
protest.
for something bigger than pensions. We're demonstrating for our entire lives, in terms of democracy and our rights, freedoms, and so on. And they will come and shoot you. So when I heard Jeremy Clarkson saying, well, look, I will put these people on firing squad, I said, oh God, where was he? I wish he could have been there instead of Idi Amin, or perhaps instead of
For our viewers around the world, we better explain who Jeremy Clarkson is. He's
he's some guy who does some things. He
appears on television, and some people think he's turned obnoxiousness into a brand name. But for those comments in particular. But leaving that aside, because he said that was just a joke and taken out of context.
Yeah, I think and this is true. It's part of the same freedom that I'm talking about.
Exactly. People are free to demonstrate, and people are free to disagree with them.
But that is why you need to see that this is not just about pensions. Pensions is just a very little minute thing. Look at the students' school fees, look at issues to do with lack of employment and people. I think that what we're doing is we're going back to the 70s, the 80s, when we will see, this is nothing. They're talking about this strike having been the biggest in a very long period of time. I can see real trouble ahead.
I'm afraid not, because what's happened since then is that the unions they weren't all that strong actually in the 70s in terms of numbers. They are so much weaker now, and they no longer control industries that really bring the country.
But they don't have to be unions. I'm not talking about unions. I'm talking about the people. For example, students, other people who will have to come up and express themselves very strongly.
I do think that you're right. There will be more and more anger, because what they were also talking about is that the distribution of the pain has been so unfair in this country, so unjust, that in the cuts that were made last week, for instance, the top 10% had a 3% cut, and the bottom 30% had a 16% cut, and time again, the richest have got away paying least, and the middle to bottom have been squeezed the hardest. And I think after a bit, people will really understand.
But But why I raised the question about whether it makes sense to talk about public sector and private sector in quite that way is if we have the fundamental rhetoric of the coalition is we're all in this together, then to divide people into different categories according to
it's worked brilliantly. It's been a brilliant political tactic to say, look, 65% of people in the private sector have no pension at all. So what are you complaining about? I mean, the answer is, of course, it's outrageous, mostly because we haven't got trade unions. Most people haven't got a penny of a pension. But the real division, I think people are beginning to realise, you can't divide up the public and the private. The private sector, private business enterprise, depends entirely on the public sector for everything, on the state.
And vice versa, though.
And vice versa, both ways around. And, you know, whether it's for the roads they drive on, for the security, for the education of their staff, for the health of their staff, all of these things are provided by the state. So you get the businessmen saying we want to shrink the state. But in fact, their businesses depend on it. Look at Africa, where failed states can't conduct business because there's no security, because there's no infrastructure. You need a state to conduct business. And we've forgotten that in this country.
That's why I think that in terms of solutions, you don't just look at simple things. You look at the whole political governance system and ideological trends and so on. So in Africa, we talk about democracy, you know, lack of democracy and good governance. Whether you try to privatize or do, nothing is going to work. Here, we've gone back to those days, perhaps not quite to the Thatcherism days, in a way where, again, total privatization of this and that, withdrawing of all state, you know, guarantees of this and that and provisions. And in a way, that is part of the problem. People are now, people who are very vulnerable, are finding themselves completely naked without any support.
Beyond that, again, to get back to the point about end-stage capitalism, is that 35 years ago, at the dawn of Reagan Thatcherism, the idea was that somehow the public sector was crowding out the private sector. But it's not true. We would have mass unemployment if we relied on the private sector to hire people, because the private sector has, for 4 decades, been shipping jobs away from Europe and America into low-wage economies. The public sector actually is a necessary part of the overall employment picture in our societies, hence the consumption patterns.
Okay.
And survival. Really.
Let's move on, because the Iranian government said it was a group of students who invaded the British embassy in Tehran, whoever it was and whatever official support they may have had. The result has been the removal of all Iranian diplomats from the UK, the return of Britain's diplomats from Tehran, a vote on sanctions in the US Senate, and increasing isolation of Iran. But so what? I mean, it's obviously very, very difficult times, but does this actually mean any kind of change in the relationship, or is it simply the playing out of domestic politics in Iran?
Look, to understand what is happening in Iran, I advise anybody to just go right now on the BBC. Usually the BBC doesn't give me that wonderful pride having read things there.
You're not here to advertise, but we love it anyway.
But there is a very wonderful article by Olivia Lang right now on the BBC, Middle Eastern sort of online. There,
on the website, yeah.
Where she's trying to put everything in historical context and goes back right to the 19th century. You know, when, you know, for example, you have right when you had the Russo-Russian Iranian war, and the British were always playing a very crucial role to make sure Iran loses out. Whether territory like Herat, you know, which is now part of Afghanistan, or then you take later on in more contemporary times where General Edmund, British man, comes there, helps to impose that Shah reign that went on. Or later on, a coup that is manufactured really when the British ask the Americans to help make a coup.
The Mossadegh coup in 1953,
exactly,
when the British
because the British are losing their oil concessions with that Iranian oil thing. Now, this is so interesting because it means the Iranians have always been aggrieved about the British. And anything British, they see it as with great suspicion.
Although it has to be said, it's also a love-hate relationship. I mean, there is real suspicion every British diplomat is a spy and all that sort of stuff. On the other hand, that there's actually a very close relationship, or has been historically, in the past 30, 40 years anyway.
Yes, absolutely. And I think crises between Britain and Iran are periodic, you know, and they go on and on with the two countries not being able to reconcile, the differences. And it just shows to a certain extent on what weak foundations the relations between Iran and the West in general are built on, in fact. But I think the sacking of the British embassy is, one shouldn't underestimate the seriousness, because it's essentially an attack on British soil. And we've heard the interview with the now former British ambassador to Tehran describe how the whole place was ransacked, portraits of Queen Victoria defaced. You know, a few years ago, gunboats would have been sent to Iran.
Haven't got any gunboats.
That's the great danger. That's what really worries me, is that this is a really tricky time when Britain, America, the West, it seems to me, has to be extraordinarily cautious. I mean, Iran is a rocky state with a lot of internal conflict, very afraid by what it's seeing, the conflagration in the countries around it. And we must do nothing that helps them to say, let's have a foreign war, let's identify our enemies as being Israel, America and Britain, to detract from the real internal turmoil that's going on there. So I think we've got to behave with incredible caution, dignity, sanctions, yes, but not saber-rattling and not giving them any opportunity to say, right, we've all got to pull together against the foreign enemy.
Michael?
Yeah, it must be incredibly frustrating. Very happy not to be a diplomat, but rather a journalist, because the regime clearly enjoys playing a game of chicken with the West. Doesn't matter who in the West. You know, just whenever they are under internal pressure, they have a number of levers they can pull.
But sorry to interrupt, but it was said to me by a British diplomat that Saddam Hussein's problem was he would come up to the brink and he wouldn't change until he got to the brink, but he didn't quite know where the brink was. And their worry about Iran, the British worry about Iran, is the same thing could happen for all the reasons that Polly said.
There are all these power centers, and because there's virtually no Western press there. There's no independent press. Although there's a tremendous amount of travel that still goes on back and forth with Iranians coming to the West. They have Western interests. They have 2 passports that go back and forth. I think that we had the Quds Force. I didn't know they were all graduate students going over the wall at the British Embassy. Who controls them? What factions? Now we're getting into kind of Sovietology we don't know. What we do know is that in this immediate situation, you've got the West on the one hand trying to isolate, maybe even get oil sanctions, but then you've got China. And China gets an awful lot of its energy from Iran. And I have never read on this show before, but I copied this out of the China Daily because I wanted to quote it accurately. Today's China Daily says, "It seems the US and European countries are driven by impulse instead of rationality in their relationship with Iran. All parties need to calm down." And that's from the coming power of the century. And so it isn't so easy to diplomatically deal with Iran, because
that's
you
not
know
a bad
China...
message.
What?
That's not a bad message, actually.
Calm down.
Well, we have a problem to do with this, not just British, but Western approaches, you know, these gung-ho type of approaches. I think what needs to happen is, if Britain wants to change things in Iran or Africa or elsewhere, support the people.
Okay,
let the people
we have
demonstrate,
to,
let the people fight for democracy.
We run out of time,
them,
but people can obviously catch up on the news with China Daily and the BBC website. That's it for Dateline London for this week. We're back next week at the same time. You can follow me on Twitter @GavinEsley. Goodbye.